Well, I've got a notification there that.
Oh.
Well, I've got a notification there that.
We are live on YouTube.
Good, well done. That's a relief.
We are live on YouTube.
Good, well done. That's a relief.
And I need to close YouTube because it's going to feed back through everything. If anyone's got YouTube open, please mute it. I've muted mine.
Look, yes.
One sugar, please.
So, do we have
Jessica, and do we have David Stevenson? Are you there with us?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Hello, Jessica, good to see you. And fingers crossed, David is somewhere knocking about. Ooh. Some familiar faces there. I've got no indication via an email that David is having any problems. Good evening, everybody. Good to see you all. That cruel, heartless John Francis has muted you all. Typical. Well, we'll just wait a moment just to make sure that David is here. David, are you with us?
74 participants and counting.
Yeah.
Andrew, if you're looking for more people, you do know that you probably have more than one screen. If you hover halfway down the bank of pictures to the right, you'll see a little arrow.
Yeah, I've been looking at that.
Everybody can see everybody else. If you've got gallery view on, then you can see lots of people. I can see.
No, I am flicking up and down. Just haven't yet got.
What's David's surname, Andrew?
Stevenson.
No, we haven't got a David Stevenson. We've got David Aston, Foster, Manning, Seymour, and Simmons, but not Stevenson.
Well, he doesn't have to utter for about another half hour, so maybe we start and keep our fingers crossed. Perhaps we could look out for him as we go. But shall we start, John, do you think? And now you're muted.
Sorry, the answer was yes.
Absolutely. Well,
shall I start the slideshow?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Not quite yet, please.
Tell me when.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I will. Yeah, lots of people in the Zoom room. You probably want to engage speaker view rather than have a screen full of images. So you go to the top right-hand corner of your screen where it says view, and then you just choose speaker, and you get whoever is speaking front and center on your screen.
We've got an anonymous David, Andrew. Is that anybody we know?
Anonymous David, are you Stevenson?
Well, it doesn't say. There's one merely called David. Can you find David and see whether it's Mr. Stevenson?
Because he may be muted and hence is not answering my call.
Well, we're all muted, but the question is whether he's Mr. Stevenson or not. Ah, David. David is also not even watching. We've not got a picture for David, so you're not going to find out who David is for a while. Let's treat David as a red herring and worry about him later.
Absolutely so. Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. John was telling me earlier that 24 countries are represented in the Vaughan Williams Society, and I'm wondering just how many we've got with us tonight. Welcome to this anniversary occasion, 100 years precisely since the first performance of Vaughan Williams's Pastoral Symphony. Michael Kennedy, faithful servant of the Vaughan Williams Society and close friend and biographer of the composer, described this as Vaughan Williams's war requiem. And Michael, I know, had a very high regard for the symphony, never mind the fact that it's rarely loud and rarely anything like allegro. Well, I'm delighted to be able to welcome, I hope I can say welcome, two distinguished guests who will help us better understand the type of experiences Vaughan Williams may have had during his Great War service on the Western Front. Firstly, Dr. Jessica Meyer, who's Associate Professor of Modern British History at the University of Leeds. Then, fingers crossed he's with us, Professor David Stevenson, who's Professor of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Wonderful to have them with us this evening, and I'll introduce them to you fully a little bit later on. First, before we start, a word of thanks to various people who've been involved in the preparations for this evening. To Rosie, Sandy and Robert for the loan of their voices, to Henry for his technical expertise, as always, Karen and Tad for the publicity work they put into this, but most especially to John Francis, the irrepressible John Francis, Vice Chairman of the Vaughan Williams Society. It's only, I guess, a couple of months ago, John, that I said to you, how about if we? And you said immediately, why not? So here we are. And John's had a huge input into the various tech, Zoom and YouTube issues. Thanks very much indeed to you, John. It's been a pleasure working with you as always. Okay, three main parts to the evening. And we start by going back to that very first performance of A Pastoral Symphony. This is your moment, John. Right, the grill room on the ground floor of Queen's Hall in London, 7:25 p.m, January the 26th, 1922. Charles and Florence Harmony with the added E, have finished their lamb chops and pushed the plates to one side. Time to explore the concert programs Charles purchased in the foyer in the way in. The Harmonies had travelled into town on the Metropolitan line from Harrow, drawn by the prospect of hearing a new work by that very nice Dr. Vaughan Williams, A Pastoral Symphony, to be performed by the orchestra of the Royal Philharmonic Society, conducted by young, dapper Adrian Boult. The Harmonies had come to Queen's Hall a few months previously for the first performance in its orchestral form of Vaughan Williams's The Lark Ascending. Instantly, they fell for it. It brought the sights and sounds and scents of rural England into the heart of the polluted, clamorous capital. What would this new pastoral symphony have to offer? Well, Charles breaks the silence that's descended over the table. Have you seen, he says, that Dr. Vaughan Williams has written about his symphony? Continues Florence. The Harmonies are so close, they often complete each other's sentences. So they eagerly read what the composer has to say, and they're puzzled, nonplussed. But why? Asks Florence. Is it called A Pastoral Symphony? Continues Charles. And you can easily sympathize with the Harmonies' confusion. This program note is simply a guide through a series of prominent musical themes in the symphony. For example, referring to the first movement, the opening subject leads to a cadence, which is frequently referred to later on, and is followed by a new figure first played by the cor anglais and taken up by the other instruments, which leads in turn to a new subject in A minor. So just musical nuts and bolts. Well, confused or not, Charles and Florence enjoyed the performance of A Pastoral Symphony that Queen's Hall evening. They found it a bit reserved, a bit on the slow side most of the time, but not without charm. And there was that bucolic bumptiousness in the third movement to lighten the tone. I'm just going to break off for a second because David has just sent me an email saying he's unable to join. So let me quickly deal with that.
Yes, that's the Queen's Hall, but it got blown up in the war, I think.
Right. Where was it? South Kent?
That's in Langham Place, right by where the BBC is now.
Oh.
Yeah.
It was a fantastic little corner of London.
Absolute
All
tragedy
Souls
that it
Langham,
was.
All Souls Langham Place, and the Langham Hotel, all in a very confined space. Well, I hope that's going to get David in. Let's keep our eyes out for that.
Acoustically, it was said to be marvellous, and it's a great tragedy that it wasn't rebuilt after the war, I think.
There's another evening to be done about Queen's Hall. Okay, so on the journey home, the Harmonies agreed the symphony sounded like, well, the Fens. A chilly wind blowing much of the time, a touch gloomy under big lowering grey skies. Perhaps the symphony represented the 4 seasons. Yes, 4 seasons in the Fens, just in the wrong order, maybe. Well, from the start and over the years, critics and commentators offered their own suggestions of which area of English countryside was represented in A Pastoral Symphony. Cotswolds, perhaps, verdant Sussex or Surrey. Always English countryside, though. But from Vaughan Williams, there came no hint of confirmation. Well, the symphony was essentially warmly received. You read from commentators that its early reception was mixed, but I'm not sure that conveys a true impression. Not everyone was convinced, sure, but by far the majority of newspaper and journal reviews I've seen took a favourable line. And one fib needs erasing from the record: the supposed scornful comment of the critic Philip Heseltine, alias the composer Peter Warlock, that the symphony represented a cow looking over a gate. You still see this wheeled out. Heseltine did indeed use that expression in reference to other pastoral music of Vaughan Williams, but not of the Pastoral Symphony, which he admired very much indeed. Well, between the wars, the symphony became a favourite at the proms, and for example, at the Three Choirs Festival, it went down well overseas, for instance, in the USA as early as 1922, and at a contemporary music festival in Prague in 1925. But as it made its way in the world, the idea held that this was an English pastoral. It was decades before the reality emerged. Early in 1938, Vaughan Williams began his relationship with the woman who eventually would become his second wife, Ursula Wood. In the autumn of that year, he conducted a pastoral symphony at the proms in Queen's Hall. Ursula was present. And after the performance, Vaughan Williams wrote her the short note, which in due course of time would turn perceptions of the symphony upside down. Some of you may know it off by heart. I'm glad you like the symphony. I did rather myself after many years. It's really wartime music. A great deal of it incubated when I used to go up night after night in the ambulance wagon at Equivre, and we went up a steep hill, and there was a wonderful Corot-like landscape in the sunset. It's not really Lambkins Frisking at all, as most people take for granted. Well, if you don't say otherwise, then of course people are going to take it for granted that a work by an English composer, well known for writing pastoral music reflecting the English rural scene, is also reflecting it in this symphony, Lambkins Frisking and all. But Vaughan Williams saw no reason to make a public statement of the truth. Anyway, it's really wartime music. And Vaughan Williams's following words there clearly referenced his time with a Royal Army Medical Corps field ambulance unit in 1916. This was based at Equivre, not far from Arras, at the northern end of the bloody Somme battlefield. Can you make out Vaughan Williams in that picture? He's amongst the, oh, look, thank you very much, John. Is that an arrow you're pointing at? Yes, that's Vaughan Williams. And you can see they've named their encampment there Pancreas Place. It is, after all, a medical unit. But in 1918, Vaughan Williams returned to the Western Front as an officer in the Royal Garrison Artillery. And it's hard to believe that his undoubtedly horrific experiences then didn't also play into his intensive work on the symphony after the Great War. We'll hear more about all that from our guests in a short while. Anyway, the information contained in this private letter to Ursula didn't seep out, it seems, until well after the Second World War. The earliest printed reference I've seen to the linkage between the symphony and Vaughan Williams's Great War service is in Frank House's 1954 book on the composer's music. House was an acquaintance of Vaughan Williams, which may explain the inside knowledge he reveals. Having said that, the only mention Howes makes of the symphony's connection to Vaughan Williams's ambulance service is the famous trumpet solo in the second movement, natural trumpet solo, surely a version of The Last Post, which we'll hear later. This is, says Howes, a recollection of camp life with the Royal Army Medical Corps at Borden in Hampshire. His only reference to Vaughan Williams's time actually on the Western Front is his service with the Royal Garrison Artillery. Well, it's then intriguing to see that A.E.F. Dickinson's bumper 1963 biography of Vaughan Williams still makes no mention of the Pastoral Symphony being related to the composer's Great War service. Word wasn't getting through. And it's the complementary works on Vaughan Williams written by Ursula Vaughan Williams and Michael Kennedy, both published in 1964, which we can perhaps say finally nailed down the fundamental provenance for the symphony. Having said that, the publication of Vaughan Williams's letters, thanks to Hugh Cobb's remarkable work, and Hugh's with us this evening, means we have easily available Vaughan Williams's intriguing words to the music writer Donald Tovey in 1927. In these, he indicates that certain material used in the last two movements of the symphony had its origins in sketches for a ballet that I was once asked to write, but discarded as I found the subject uncongenial. It was something about a voice in a wood, and the themes of the scherzo in the Pastoral Symphony were to have been a dance of oofs and goblins, and at the end, they all run off, which you can certainly hear in the music. Just how much of this ballet material is used in the symphony and how Vaughan Williams might have molded it to reflect his wartime experiences, we seem not to know. Anyway, to cut the long story short, these days the symphony's Great War connection is fully established and perhaps almost too much taken for granted. And nothing demonstrates that more swiftly perhaps than CD sleeve designs for recordings of a pastoral symphony like these. Although it's strange that images of the English countryside still turn up on CD sleeve covers for new pastoral symphony recordings. And yet, hang on a moment. Our gaze may have been diverted from English rural idylls to the scarred landscapes of the Western Front, a dramatic shift. But it remains the case that in that 1938 letter to Ursula, Vaughan Williams gave us very, very little to go on when it comes to understanding just how his wartime experiences transmuted into the sounds of this symphony. What we can do is at least take on board in some detail what those experiences would likely have been, hence the invitation to Jessica and David to join us this evening. But before we hear from them, I think it's worth considering why Vaughan Williams was so reluctant to offer more background to this symphony to aid the listener. What I think and hope will emerge is information that's useful in considering many other pieces of music by Vaughan Williams. That, incidentally, is a picture that appeared in 1920, rather haunted look on Vaughan Williams's face. Well, the first thought, you may be saying to yourself, well, isn't Vaughan Williams just a typical Great War soldier, deeply reluctant to talk at all about his horrific experiences? In his case, the option was to mediate those experiences through the music of his Pastoral Symphony and other works. However, this reluctance to talk about his music was nothing new. He always hated talking about himself, not least his war service, and about the meanings of his music, what it described, So why this reluctance? Well, Ursula Vaughan Williams pointed out that her husband was more shy than people might have believed. Perhaps this is a factor. Maybe the shyness made him uneasy when it came to talking about the deeper motivations underlying his music, even though he was hardly shy of writing and lecturing about music and musicians in general. Maybe there was an influence here from his late 19th century public school upbringing. At Charterhouse, you were taught to be modest and self-effacing, slow to assert yourself. Perhaps that's relevant here. But I think the main consideration is Vaughan Williams's long-held views on the nature of the language of music. And two main thoughts here. Firstly, Vaughan Williams wanted his music to be assessed according to its intrinsic qualities, without the distraction of information stating what it was about or meant. As far as he was concerned, he wrote absolute music, as the phrase goes. Whatever life experiences inspire it, and he admitted they could for him, music should stand or fall on its own merits as music. Every listener can make their own judgment on those merits, and if they also decide what, for them, the music is about or means or describes, that's fine for them. Secondly, Vaughan Williams saw music as overwhelmingly the language of emotion. That's the magic. That's what marks it off from mere words. Well, here he is in a 1902 article about Wagner opera. The nature of music is that it can express emotion, but cannot touch reason or fact. Words, on the other hand, cannot express emotion, but can only indicate emotion through the medium of fact. Well, not easy perhaps to completely grasp what he's saying, but we might deduce that if we take this pastoral symphony as an example, the music has much to do with expressing emotions associated with Vaughan Williams's Great War experiences. But he can't explain in words what those emotions are, because words cannot express emotion. So music, by some alchemy, expresses particular emotion and then appeals directly to the individual listener's emotions. But it's very likely that this working principle was picked up from Hubert Parry, from Parry's writings on music, and via Vaughan Williams's time studying with him at the Royal College of Music. Vaughan Williams hero-worshipped Parry. Well, at this point you may be thinking, well, it's obvious that a major function of music is to express emotion. Obvious, isn't it? Well, not so obvious that Vaughan Williams didn't feel he had to make the point. And we should be aware of the historical context here. As the 19th century ran its course, there was an ever-increasing vogue among composers for writing program music, music that purported to describe stuff. Purely instrumental music could illustrate the action in a story or drama or historical narrative. So it's the opposite of absolute music. The music's program is printed in the concert notes bought by the public, and this enables them to follow the action in the music. What fun! An obvious short form example is Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture. You hear the Russian prayers for deliverance, the respective French and Russian armies joining battle, sounds of triumph, bells and cannon as the Russians are victorious. But there are so many other examples of program music. As Vaughan Williams was finding his feet as a composer, the darling of the program music genre was Richard Strauss. You think of works like Ein Heldenleben and Till Eulenspiegel. However, many high-minded souls, Vaughan Williams very much among them, felt that such stated programs debased music, the language of music. Those words of his again. The nature of music is that it can express emotion, but cannot touch reason or fact. Well, the problem comes when you decide to give a piece of purely instrumental music a descriptive title, but then refuse to explain yourself further. A descriptive title inevitably begs the question from listeners, why does it have that title? A perfectly reasonable question for the harmonies to ask. Easier on your audience, perhaps, to give such works no descriptive title. And Adrian Bolt, who conducted the Pastoral Symphony's first performance, apparently counseled Vaughan Williams against giving it the name. So I suppose the question here is this: if Vaughan Williams was determined to give his Symphony No. 3 its pastoral title, why didn't he give at least some kind of limited guidance as to the provenance of the music, its basic origins, to encourage a frame of mind in the listener, to enhance the understanding and appreciation of the music? But no, his approach never wavered, never keen to talk about his motivations or what his music was about or meant. And I'm reminded of the occasion in 1934 when Vaughan Williams worked on the organisation of a pageant at Abinger in Surrey with the novelist E.M. Forster on the left there. Afterwards, Forster remarked to the composer that if he got an idea into his head, you could not get it out. That apparently was his emphasis, very much so, when he said that. Well, one final thought before we move on the programme note, which so puzzled the harmonies that night at Queen's Hall in January 1922. I'm wondering if we shouldn't look at what had recently happened over Vaughan Williams's London Symphony. It all became a bit of a tangle. He first of all refused to write anything at all for the concert programme for the symphony's first performance in March 1914. His great friend George Butterworth wrote one instead, incorporating a few suggested descriptive images. Perhaps responding to press comment, which assumed the work must have had a programme, Vaughan Williams wrote a very short note for a subsequent performance, which emphasised that while elements of the symphony might appear to be descriptive, Big Ben sounding, the River Thames flowing, the tumult on London streets, and so on, this was not his intention. The symphony, he said, must stand or fall as absolute music. We should think of it as a symphony by a Londoner, so a Londoner's emotional response to London. Elsewhere, he said the symphony represented the spirit of London. Well, then sometime in the second half of 1920, Vaughan Williams received a visit from the eminent British conductor Albert Coates and his wife Madelon. Coates was about to conduct the US premieres of the work, and he and Madelon felt Americans needed much more information on how the symphony described a city most of them wouldn't know from personal experience. Well, quite what happened at this meeting was disputed later, but it seems some information was extracted, and Madelon Coates's fairly lengthy note appeared in the US concert programs. When he saw its highly descriptive approach, Vaughan Williams went through the roof and almost into orbit. It drips with the kind of saccharine prose that some of us remember from those voiceovers on American TV series for children in the 1950s and 60s. And here's a taste. The first movement opens at daybreak by the river. Old Father Thames flows calm and silent under the heavy grey dawn, deep and thoughtful, shrouded in mystery. London sleeps, and in the hushed stillness of early morning, one hears Big Ben solemnly strike the half hour. Suddenly the scene changes. One is on the Strand in the midst of the bustle and turmoil of morning traffic. Well, on seeing the note, Vaughan Williams demanded that it be withdrawn immediately. Thankfully, it remains accessible, and it's a fascinating document which begs a good few questions. But you can see that the London Symphony experience might perhaps have taught Vaughan Williams a lesson or two. Lesson 1, don't let anyone, even an eminent conductor, inveigle you into talking about what your music describes or means beyond strictly confined limits. And lesson 2, be wary of ever refusing to write a program note. Writing one means that you retain control over the information that's released to the public, however plain and unrevealing it may be for many people.
London Symphony.
The learning of this lesson over the London Symphony just a few months before would help explain the spare nature of the Pastoral Symphony note and of Vaughan Williams's notes for subsequent symphonies, which I imagine would have bemused Charles and Florence harmony with the added E all over again. Well, after that, you'll need a bit of a pause. We'll take 5 minutes now for you to top up drinks or whatever. And during this time, we'll play a 5-minute medley of extracts from the Pastoral Symphony. Rather than play a sequence of short clips through the evening, I'm blowing all my music allowance on this collection of extracts. We'll aim to play this again later to see how your view of the music might have changed after what you've heard, not least from Jessica and David. And David is with us now. Can we just check that before we go any further? David, if you could unmute yourself and just yell, that'd be great. I think he must be.
Can you hear me?
There we are.
Yes,
David, I'm sorry you had that problem, but really, really good to see you. You missed my welcome, but you get another one, you get an extra one from me now. Right. But we're just going to have 5 minutes of music while you do whatever you want to do, and we'll be back to talk to Jessica and David in just a moment. So let's bring up the music. So just a reminder that if you've not chosen speaker view at the top right-hand corner of your screen, this may be a good moment to do that. Anyway, so hold those sounds in your heads as we move on. We turn to our guests, Jessica Meyer and David Stevenson. If Vaughan Williams was so tight-lipped about his specific war experiences and how they were mediated through the Pastoral Symphony, we can at least go some way towards imagining what those experiences might have been, especially on the Western Front, thanks to Jessica and David. Well, Jessica studied first at Yale in the United States, then at Cambridge before joining the University of Leeds in 2011. She's now Associate Professor of Modern British History. Her particular interest lies, and I quote, at the intersection of the histories of gender, particularly masculinity, medicine and warfare. So gender, medicine and warfare. And her most recent book is An Equal Burden, The Men of the Royal Army Medical Corps in the First World War. David gained an undergraduate degree and PhD at Cambridge before commencing his long association with the LSE in 1982, where he's Professor of International History. And David is the author of a long string of admired books on the Great War, looked at from a multiplicity of angles. The most relevant to us this evening is his 2011 book, With Our Backs to the Wall, the story of the closing months of the war. First, the Allies with their backs to the wall, then the German forces. David's also been an advisor to the Imperial War Museum's First World War galleries. So between our two guests, we have the two periods of Vaughan Williams's Western Front service well covered. You may want to put questions to Jessica and David later on. You can start posting them now using the chat facility at the bottom of the screen there, and we'll see if we can get through a few at the end of the main proceedings. Jessica and David, if you could both unmute yourselves at this point, please, and if any of you want to chip in when I'm actually talking to the other, please do that. Don't wait to be asked. Well, Jessica, good evening to you and a very warm welcome. Vaughan Williams is 41 when the war starts. He comes from this artistic background. I mean, how typical might he have been for a Royal Army Medical Corps volunteer?
Yes, well, thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to contribute this evening and for your very warm welcome. It's lovely to be here. How typical was Vaughan Williams as a volunteer with the RAMC? Actually, remarkably typical. So I think we tend to think of 41 as being quite old for men to volunteer for the British Armed Forces. We think of the men who fought in the First World War as being very young. In fact, even in the early years of the war, the age ranges of the men who were fighting in the military service were between the ages of 18 and early 40s. And that, of course, gets extended over the course of the war up to the early 50s by 1918 because of demands for manpower. So someone in their early 40s as a volunteer was not necessarily unusual in the early months with the rush to the colours, and certainly not for the medical services, which did recruit from 1914 into early 1915, but tended to take men who were not deemed fit for overseas service as combatants. Some men did volunteer for religious reasons or because they saw their professional expertise as fitting with the medical services. But most of the men who end up in the medical services in the very early months of the war are there because they are too short, because they are older, over age, because they are unfit in some way. And the journalist Ward Muir, who serves as a medical orderly at the 3rd London General Hospital, writes a series of very amusing articles, which later get published in a book called Observations of an Orderly. pointing out the extent to which this stereotype of the overaged, unfit man as a member of the RAMC enters public imagination, and he mocks it and is very amusing on the subject. Vaughan Williams is quite typical as well in terms of his artistic background. Muir was was a member of the Chelsea Arts Club, and in fact, it looks as if the entire Chelsea Arts Club simply upped in August 1914 and went and volunteered, because they almost all end up at the Third London General in Wandsworth across the river. And that includes C.R.W. Nevinson, Francis Derwent Wood, who would then go on to form what was called the Tin Nose Department, reconstructing, creating facial prostheses for men with facial injuries. So there are a number of men from that sort of, particularly London's cultural scene and artistic background, who end up in the war, serving with the medical corps. Stanley Spencer famously is another example.
Yeah. So it's a full 18 months before Vaughan Williams actually goes out to the Western Front. And he got very impatient, in fact, that he wanted to do something. So how rigorous would the training, the actual medical training, have actually been?
For a serviceman like Williams, volunteer serviceman like Williams, not significant. There would have been training in first aid and fairly rigorous training in stretcher drill, how to pick men up and carry them, essentially, and basic first aid training. So first aid as a discipline had been developing since the 1860s with the formation of first the National Aid Society, later the British Red Cross, and also the St. John's Ambulance Association, which had wanted to train civilians actually to act as first responders. So there is a tradition that enters the military with the Haldane reforms in 1909, when a medical military reserve is created, and these volunteers are trained. However, the medical expertise lies with the officers of the Royal Army Medical Corps, who have to be doctors, who have to have professional medical degrees, and the men of the Corps do not have the equivalent medical degrees, and there is a certain amount of protection. The officer corps isn't too keen on training men in medical specifics. That being said, the men of the Corps do pick up a lot of medical knowledge as they go, and some quite special expertise. Things like, you don't move a man when he has an abdominal wound if you can prevent it, because major organs bleed excessively and he's very likely to bleed out. You don't feed a man or offer him a drink for similar reasons.
Well, it's interesting. Formally, as I've said, Vaughan didn't talk about his war very much at all and write about it, but he does mention that he was, as part of his training, sent up to Guy's Hospital for a month to try my apprentice hands on the uncomplaining poor. I learned a lot in the way of bandages, stitches, fomentations, is that my writing, operations, dissections, and the rest. So at least he got to go to Guy's.
Yes, and there's in Cambridge, the first Eastern hospital has RAMC servicemen circulating through it to get training. It is primarily in things like bandaging and portering work. What we would think of as a hospital porter is very much the role that these men will play. They also are occasionally theatre assistants in operating theatres, including on the front line, but there are specialist units offering anesthesia and similar. The other types of expertise that you see emerging from the ranks of the RAMC are dispensers.
Well, because the other bit of the training, other major bit of the training, of course, was in fitness. You're always reading the Vaughan Williams off on a route march here and there. And there's a lovely, his great friend Harry Steggles mentions these training marches refers to Vaughan Williams. He slouched rather than march, but never complained. I can see him now in my mind's eye, his huge frame bent forward, his pack perched on his back and wobbling as he marched. Of course, they discovered very early on that he did indeed have flat feet, which in itself would have meant that he wouldn't have been a very effective fighter on the Western Front. So there's that 18 months. Why can we imagine there was this 18 months period before they went out?
It would really be a question of what division the medical units attached to, the need. There is a delay in the early months of the war, which causes huge scandal in the British press about the effectiveness of the medical services. And under Sir Alfred Keogh, these are reformed in 1915. So there's sort of a wider delay going on with getting the medical services overseas in sufficient numbers and in sufficient order. So that would have been part of it, but it is by 1916, by the build up to the Somme, that you start to see all medical units being sent and a much more efficient organization of the medical services and much greater communication between the military and the medical services.
Right, so they go across, they sail from Southampton on the 22nd of June 1916, and there's more marching before he gets to the place where he's going to work not far away from Arras. He writes to Gustav Holst, I'm a wagon orderly and go up the line every night to bring back wounded and sick in a motor ambulance. All this takes place at night, except an occasional day journey for urgent cases. What would wagon mean in this context? It suggests horse-drawn, but he then says it's a motor ambulance.
Yes, so at the start of the war, it would have predominantly been horse-drawn. After the initial scandals of 1914, there's a great push to provide motor ambulances to the medical corps. And I think by 1918, there's an allocation of 7 motor ambulances to each corps. But of course, the medical units are in transition at the moment. So the field ambulance, which isn't an ambulance car, it is an established unit of just over 200 men, 226 men, is responsible for transportation. And at the beginning of the war, that is primarily by horse-drawn ambulance wagon, and increasingly becomes by an ambulance car, would be what they would define, what we term as a motor ambulance these days.
Yeah, well, let's have a look, 1 or 2 images here, Jessica. Mm-hmm. Put them all, most of them on the one screen. We can see the top left-hand corner there, Vaughan Williams standing by a motor ambulance, and we can see presumably that. Well, how many stretchers might you have got into one of those motor ambulances if they're racked up by the look of things?
4 lying, 6 sitting is the general rule. Yeah. But part of what happens is that the early motor ambulances, at least, and they do increasingly become standardized, but the early versions are simply converted private vehicles. Yeah. And one of my favorite stories from my own research is the Squire of Lotherton Hall, which is a local stately home now owned by Leeds City Museums, commissioned his motor car to turn it into an ambulance and sent it out to France, and sent his chauffeur with it to drive it. There is absolutely no record about whether the chauffeur agreed to this bit of volunteering on his behalf or not. Yeah.
Obviously, we've got a range of pictures there, not in a particularly clever order, but if we go sort of clockwise, we then see Vaughan Williams sitting down. I think that might be in Watford during his training, and then you can see stretcher bearing training in the top right there. We then see a horse-drawn wagon, and then assorted shots of Vaughan Williams, sort of looks like playing the fool, sort of bottom right there. And we see him with a band of musicians. We'll talk about that in due course. But then we see some stretcher parties just behind the front line, in the one sort of in the centre at the bottom there. I mean, what would have been a wagon orderly's specific role? He's not driving one of the ambulances.
No, so my guess is that he would have primarily been deployed between the casualty clearing station and the main or one of the advanced dressing stations, depending on the state of the roads. Because the thing about travel via motor ambulance is you do need roads, otherwise you get stuck in the mud. So there are large stretches where the field ambulance is responsible for transporting men that simply have either been destroyed by shell fire or there were no good roads to begin with. And those are traversed by the ambulance corps stretcher bearers. What you're seeing on the screen is a schematic that I drew up for as part of my research for my most recent book, which shows you the passage of a man, a wounded man, through the various sites of care. And from the regimental aid post, where he's brought by the regimental stretcher bearers, that's where he becomes the responsibility of the field ambulance. So he's taken by stretcher bearers, undertaking what are called manual carries via a series of dressing stations back to the casualty clearing station. So that's the space in which Vaughan Williams would have been working. And the casualty clearing station is the next big medical unit where a man could be cared for.
So just how close to the front might he have had to go then?
I think it's unlikely he would have gone all the way up to the regimental aid post in the front line, but a casualty clearing station was anything between 6 and 12 miles behind the line, and the dressing stations ran between, up to a mile. Potentially, it would depend on where the roads ran and how destroyed the landscape was on any given evening.
Yeah. Awkward question, I know, but I mean, what sights might he have seen in the course of that job? Let's spell it out very, very gently. He saw the full horror of war. That's what we're going to say.
Absolutely. He would have seen men with deeply distressing wounds, men in pain, and the motor ambulances in particular are really not very pleasant places for men to travel in. They are poorly ventilated. They are dark. There's no light that is let in. They're stuck in there with other men in pain. So he would have heard a great deal of suffering as well as seen it. And then in addition, he would have seen the destroyed landscapes that we're very familiar with from a number of the pictures that, the photographs that the Imperial War Museum has collected over the years.
We just skirted these images. These are pictures of the area where he served. There's the cemetery at Equivre in the bottom right-hand corner there, and I guess lots of soldiers that he assisted would be lying in that cemetery. And then we see Mont Saint-Éloi, very slight rise in the land, but I've sort of assumed, I don't know if it's true, that this is the rise that Vaughan Williams drove up when he saw the Corot-like landscapes. I've actually been there myself, and the view, even though it doesn't look all that high, is very dramatic. So one of the other things on this picture was that image at the bottom left there of Vaughan Williams behind the musical group. Was music an important part of life amidst all this horror and terror? This would be fairly normal, would it?
Absolutely. And there's an interesting point about that picture of the band in that prior to some of the reforms that made the military medical services more formal, but the regimental bandsmen acted as stretcher bearers. And so you have the regimental stretcher bearers who are responsible for bringing men in from no man's land to the regimental aid post. Those persist. What changes is that they're now simply drawn from the wider ranks of the regiment rather than from the bandsmen in particular. But that association between the bandsman, between music and medical care remains. And there is actually quite a strong understanding, not just in the British Army, but in the French Army as well. I have a student who's written her PhD thesis on this, of the therapeutic nature of music, the role of music in supporting men's morale, in keeping them in as good mental health as is possible under the circumstances. Music is hugely important, and the interplay between medicine and music is also actually remarkably well understood.
Yes, of course, bandsmen today, in all the different regiments and different types of bands, still the association with medical help on the battlefield is still front and center as far as their lives are concerned. We could talk for ages, Jessica, but I need to move on to David. But say, do chip in while David is talking. David, it's great to have you with us. I'm sorry there was that hiatus there, but really good to see you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's loud enough. So Vaughan Williams serves with the Medical Corps on the Western Front. He's then transferred with his unit to Salonika. He seems to have got rather bored with life there and got a little bit fractious about the sort of relationships between officers and men. And one way or another, he manages to get a trip back to the UK and gets himself onto a training scheme for the Royal Garrison Artillery. He's 44 when he comes back to the UK. How unusual was a commission at this age by this time in the war?
Not as unusual as you would think, particularly as I think, as Jessica was saying, by the time we get to 1918, first, the British Army is much larger than far larger than it had been at the start of the war, and therefore needed a much larger officer corps. And secondly, casualties among the officer corps have been extremely heavy. I mean, proportionately, they were heavier among junior officers than they were among the other ranks, as they're called at the time, the private soldiers. And one of the features that you see of the British Army in 1918 is a much younger average soldiery. People were being sent out to the Western Front at the age of 19, without being middle-aged or mature. And on the other hand, their officers were drawn from a much wider, of necessity, were drawn from a much wider range of social background and age than had happened previously. This is true actually of all the armies that are involved in the First World War, but it's certainly true of the British Army. If I can just give you an example, may come back to this, but there's a sort of parallel between Vaughan Williams's experiences and that of the poet Edward Thomas, who was born, I think, in 1875, so it's 3 years younger than Vaughan Williams. But had also volunteered, had also become a second lieutenant in the Royal Garrison Artillery in 1917, had taken on the very hazardous role of front forward observation officer, in which role he was killed in the opening fighting at the Battle of Arras on the Easter Monday, 1917. It is interesting for all sorts of ways, and I don't know whether you come across any actual personal encounter between the two, but in their different ways, they're both very important in developing this artistic and cultural sense of Englishness, which you see as a movement in literary movement as well as a movement in music. Yeah,
so here we got this very shy, flat-footed, artistically sensitive Vaughan Williams, and he trains, as far as we can see, in all the basic details of what it means to fire heavy weaponry. I mean, what sort of training would that have been? What would it have involved?
Well, it would have involved laying the gun and coming to understand some of the importance of how you aim the gun, and how you load it and unload it. One of the features of the First World War artillery is that it's what's called quick-firing artillery. It's a result of inventions that had happened in the late 19th century, really in the 1890s, but the guns were being loaded from the back, not from the muzzle, as they are if you see the old shots of the American Civil War or Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, they're loaded from the back. They're breech loaded, in other words, and they have a screw groove, if you like, a circular groove within the barrel. But the upshot of all of this is that the shell can be fired much faster and much longer range. Now, the Royal Garrison Artillery, the typical weapon that was being used by the British Army by this phase in the war, was a 60-pounder, 5-inch, so about twice the barrel diameter of a field gun, ordinary field gun, and firing a much heavier shell, something weighing about 60 pounds. In other words, if you think of that, that's nearly four stone of high explosive or gas that's being directed towards the enemy. The distance.
So gas. He would have known that he might have been involved in the firing of gas shells.
It's very likely that he would have been involved in that, because by 1918, the weight of gas being fired on the Western Front was twice as heavy in 1918 as it had been in 1917, which had been twice as high as it was in 1916. So it's a gas-soaked battlefield, and much of the purpose of firing gas was actually to silence the enemy artillery, given that the guns were normally stationed and protected in so-called gun pits. And if you could land a gas shell in or near that gun pit, the gas would sink because it was heavier than air, and incapacitate the gun crew. It wouldn't necessarily kill them, but would force them to abandon the weapon. So yes. I'm talking a bit in technical terms, but you asked me a technical question, and I think one of the roles of a second lieutenant would not be primarily a technical person, but I think they would need to understand the technicalities of the weaponry, and getting men of all ranks to understand and be able to operate the weaponry was a key part of Army doctrine. Yes.
Well, the other interesting thing about it being shy and artistically sensitive is that presumably he's got to be trained in the arts of leadership.
I think he has, and the arts of two things really: of officer camaraderie, of being able to mix well with his fellow officers, and actually be able to cope with the officers from above, with the staff officers when they're arriving and giving orders, perhaps to explain the orders to his men, produce some kind of justification and sense and meaning for a military operation. But yes, of course, the army took very seriously the British Army. I think, despite the sort of stereotype, many British soldiers, British officers had a kind of public school related ethos of they had a duty of care for their men, and indeed for their animals too. As you know, he was particularly concerned with the welfare of horses. Yeah,
which we'll come on to that in a moment. In fact, there's one little vignette from his Batman actually on the Western Front, A.J. Moore, who had been a theological student. So the lovely little description: Lieutenant Vaughan Williams has the respect of the whole battery as a kind, firm and considerate officer. In wartime, with heavy guns, powerful horses, and all the work of dealing with the equipment necessary to the battery, tempers can easily get frayed. With him, this rarely happened. So he managed to combine the necessity for leadership with that mindset.
Yes, it's very interesting, the implicit understanding in that letter of what makes for good leadership. It's actually the stress is on kindness and calmness. Not necessarily. Next.
Whoops.
I think the recording may have stopped for a moment.
Whether that can be started again, I don't know. So, Vaughan Williams, good, there we go. So, returns to the Western Front in early March 1918. Why a deployment in France at this particular time in the war? Can we guess, David?
Well, almost certainly related to the expectation that there's upcoming a major German offensive, and which of course began on the 21st of March 1918. And he was sent to the sector of the Western Front where that first German offensive of 1918 happened. But the British had known since January, February of 1918 that there had been increasing signs that there was going to be a major German attack in the spring of 1918. So there's a long period of expectancy, during which one of the decisions that were taken was to move units across and then equipment across from the British Isles to the British sector of the Western Front in France and in Belgium. So the British were reinforcing in preparation for what they knew was likely to be a German onslaught on a very large scale.
Yes. Well, let's look at some of these images. The central image there is Vaughan Williams at home in Chelsea at, I think, Christmas 1917, so just a few months before he went across the Western Front. He's passed out as a second lieutenant from his cadet training corps, and two other pictures of him wearing the uniform of an officer. And when he gets across the Western Front, he finds himself not dealing with guns as such or fighting. He's looking after horses. Now, we're used to the idea that the cavalry charge is pretty well dead and buried as an idea now in the Great War. But look at all those horses. How important are horses still by this time in the war?
They're absolutely essential to all of the armies in the First World War, not primarily for use as cavalry, though actually cavalry operations continue on a much larger scale than we might think. Even on the Western Front in 1918, cavalry was still used as a mounted arm once the front loosened up and became more mobile. But the primary thing, as you see from the middle screen, from the middle picture here, is for transport. And to give an idea of the scale of this, in 1917, summer of 1917, the British Army on its own had about 368,000 horses and about 82,000 mules. Don't forget the mules, yeah? So that's more than 500,000 for four-legged creatures, horses and mules, being involved. Mostly that, overwhelmingly, that would have been for moving goods and moving equipment, rather than for actual military.
And looking after them is a very demanding thing. I mean, it is a very labour-intensive looking after them.
It's very labour-intensive, and it's also very resource-intensive. The horses eat far more food than men. And they also need, of course, a lot of veterinary care. One of the reasons why the British had an advantage over the Germans was that the Germans didn't have enough vets and didn't have enough fodder. So that thousands of the German army at the beginning of 1918 is tens of thousands of horses short of what it really needs. Whereas the British Army does have the horses, many of them actually imported across the Atlantic, if you think about it, in ships, past German submarines. You know? But the British and indeed the French are much better equipped logistically for travel ahead of the railhead. There's good rail transport up to a certain number of miles behind the front line. But once you get beyond that, yes, there are motor trucks, but there are all sorts of problems with motor lorries, and there certainly aren't enough of them. So that it's for the army to keep moving. And in 1918, the fighting does become much more mobile. It's vital to have very large numbers of horses. They require feeding and veterinary care and training.
Well, so here we have a map indicating the German offensive that you were talking about. It doesn't look so very much on the map there, but this was a really, really scary time for the Allied forces, was it not?
Well, to put it in perspective, there's 5 major German attacks between the end of March and the middle of July 1918. And that shows you the territory that they conquer, which may look fairly small on the map, but I don't know if the pointer will work. Yes, it will. The March attack, which is the first one, advances about 55 miles. The May attack, which is the third one, also advances about 55 miles. And look where they're heading. Yeah? The March attack, followed by the April attack, which is here, these are driving the British back towards the Channel ports. The May attack is mainly directed against the French and is driving them back towards Paris. The Germans cover about half the distance between where they start and the French capital city. So that the Germans are moving towards points of major strategic significance. And they're threatening what's not shown on the map here, but the main Allied railway network. The Allies have a trunk line going down from the Channel ports down towards Paris and then out towards the east. And those trunk lines are in danger of being severed by the German advances. So in fact, they aren't severed, and the Allies are able to keep the vital lines of communication open. But it is a very tense time. At least 3 times during that, the cabinet in London was extremely worried that the Germans were going to break through, perhaps separate the British and French armies and drive the British back towards the Channel ports and into the sea. And
of course, there was the famous statement of Haig, British commander, about backs to the wall, the title of your book, David.
Yes, with our backs to the wall and each believing in the justice of our cause, we must fight to the end. Yeah.
So we know that Vaughan Williams was involved in retreats, maybe not as dramatic as in other sectors. And eventually the advance is stemmed and the pendulum swings back the other way. And now we've got this war of movement. And presumably that means that Vaughan Williams sees so much more of the war than you would see spending most of your time in a trench. Suddenly it's like the war is opened out in front of you, the various episodes in the war.
Yeah, the map shows you where the Germans get to by July. from mid-July to mid-November, and the armistice on the 11th of November, it's the Allies who are counterattacking and advancing. And they advance about 100 miles. So they get over the French frontier, they get into Belgium, liberate most of Belgium and most of France, and are getting towards the German border, though they're not entering Germany before the ceasefire. So that roughly means they're advancing about a mile a day, which is nothing like as fast as the Allies are moving through France in 1944 after the D-Day landings, but it's a very considerable rate of progress by comparison with what had happened between 1915 and 1917, when for all practical purposes the Western Front had been stuck. Something like the Battle of the Somme, for example, it had taken 4 months to advance 6 miles, and Passchendaele in 1917 is rather similar. So it's a much faster rate of movement than had taken place in the middle front, than the middle years of the war, when, as you say, the dominating feature of the Western Front had been a stalemate and trench warfare. That means that the kind of picture that you see here, Vaughan Williams would have seen this during the retreat, because he was in one of the sectors where the fastest retreats happened in the late March of 1918. But in the later phases, from August 1918 onwards, when he was involved in mobile warfare, he would have seen a different and much less devastated scene. Although oddly enough, at the very end, he's involved in what's called the Fifth Battle of Ypres. At the end of September 1918, he and his unit are fighting on the old battlefield of Ypres, which had seen so much fighting during the trench period in 1914, 1915, and 1917. And that was still very much a wasteland of the kind that you see here.
So there can be no doubt that he was in real danger doing the job that he was doing within the parameters of this toing and froing of the front line.
Yeah, I think he would have spent a lot of time in German artillery range, and also possibly within the range of German air attack. Because remember, another feature of the fighting by 1918 is that air power is much more important. Both sides have much larger numbers of aircraft and are using them for ground attack, for strafing, if you like, as it used to be called in the Second World War. So I think that there's no doubt that what he was involved in was a hazardous occupation, German action, but also he's moving across land that's full of unexploded shells, booby traps, and so on.
And he would have been aware of the possibility of gas attacks. We don't have no record of him actually being directly threatened by gas, but that was a possibility all the time.
Yes, so certainly if he was within a few miles of the front line.
So the Allies finally do work themselves into a position where the Germans sue for peace. The armistice happens. And then Vaughan Williams describes in a letter about how flat he feels. He doesn't feel a sense of great victory having been won. I mean, was that a common sort of feeling amongst soldiers once the armistice was signed?
I think that was a common feeling among soldiers on the Allied side. I'm glad you said soldiers rather than civilians, because of course in London there was pandemonium soon after 11 o'clock on 11th of November 1918. We had lots of eyewitness descriptions of the cheering crowds in Whitehall. But at the front, there seems a sense of anticlimax seems to be very common, and a sense also of disbelief that it was actually possible to get out of your foxhole or get away from your cover and walk around within the close proximity to the enemy without being fired at, without having to think about shells. Not possible to think that you would actually be returning home and be seeing your family again. And lots of soldiers actually found it very difficult actually to believe that this was true.
So, David, you make the contrast there between the soldier's sense of anticlimax and the jubilation at home. Do we see the seeds there of that feeling amongst servicemen and women, no doubt, that people at home just won't understand how awful it really was? Therefore, I won't talk about this war, except perhaps with my comrades.
Yeah, you have to be careful about this, because this is a kind of stereotype. And we see it in the film, for example, or the 1932 film of All Quiet on the Western Front. The hero returns to his family in Germany and can't communicate with them. Undoubtedly, for many soldiers, it was like that. And that's why veterans organizations remain so important in many European countries for decades after the war had come to an end. But there were plenty of other soldiers who actually had no difficulty in talking about it, who wrote about it in their letters home, though they had to be careful because they were aware the letters were censored, but they could speak to their families about it and did communicate, I think, with their families when they got back. My own grandfather, if I can be personal about this, who was served in the South Wales Borderers and was a volunteer in 1914 and served through to 1918, but he certainly talked about it to his grandchildren. He was still doing that up until he died at the age of 94. So it could be a form of therapy to talk about. It wasn't necessarily that people of that time were all repressed and bottled up, as we tend to think.
Jessica.
If I could just jump in here, because my first book was in fact about the types of writing that men did during the war and in its aftermath. And I think David's absolutely right that for many men, there was a need to talk. I was very interested, Andrew, in your description of Vaughan Williams' ideas about music, describing emotions in a way that words couldn't. And I think one of the things that men did struggle with in writing about war is simply to encompass in words what it was they were seeing. And the part of the sense of not being able to communicate was there simply wasn't a language that they necessarily felt they had, or that they didn't feel competent in transferring onto paper to tell their families what it was they had been through. Not that they didn't want to, but they didn't know what the language was. And music perhaps could step in and act, certainly for someone like Vaughan Williams, I expect, in a way that words couldn't.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much, Jessica and David, for those fascinating and, of course, often disturbing insights into Vaughan Williams's Great War. Please do, we now have 6, it looks like we've got 6 posted questions, but keep those coming and we'll try and get through some of those at the end, which isn't all that far away now. But we move on to the third segment of this evening. I can find it. So in much of his Pastoral Symphony, Vaughan Williams chose music and emotion rather than words to express aspects of what it meant to serve on the Western Front. If we want words to convey the eyewitness experiences of servicemen and women, there is, of course, as David was saying there, a large amount of material out there in letters, diaries, biographical works, and also in poetry, of course. And it's not hard to find plentiful reference to an awareness of the fact that this ghastly war was being fought in formerly peaceful pastoral surroundings. Such an irony that largely urban societies took their quarrels into the countryside and duly wreaked havoc there. So what follows now to basically end our evening is a mix of words and images referencing the Western Front countryside. These hopefully will put Vaughan Williams's Pastoral Symphony in some kind of helpful context. The sequence takes us in steps through the defilement of the pastoral and on to nature's defiant response at the end. The images are both photos and paintings by servicemen, but also a number by the remarkable Canadian war artist Mary Ryder Hamilton. I'm sorry that her paintings aren't annotated, but they're mainly towards the end of this video mix, which lasts about 25 minutes. She arrived in France and Belgium only in 1919, capturing the look of a landscape in the process of a recovery. Well, just as a preface, some lines from a fellow member of Vaughan Williams's Field Ambulance Unit, Cyril Chitty, and this is the countryside in which he served. All the foreground and the fields as far as I could reach were beautiful with flowering plants, tansy, and others far too numerous to specify. After the drumming gunfire of the night before, the sense of peace, the grandeur of desolation, and the beauty and triumphant nature sank into my inmost being.
In these these idyllic surroundings we were happy. Golden fields rippling in the wind healed the sight of our eyes, and the green depths of the woodland shadows, like soft music, quietened the tortured nerves of our bodies. We awoke in barns at sunrise to hear not the angry crashes of the morning strafe, but the forgotten songs of birds. Private E. W. Parker.
I was often conscious of the great contrast between the man-made ugliness and horrors of the war-torn countryside and the fresh, unchanging harmony and beauty of nature. Certainly, I've never lived so close to nature since, nor been so acutely aware of life, the abundance of colour and scent. In those fields near Albert, where for nearly 4 years death reigned, I was never more alive. Corporal Fred Hodges.
A Lark Above the Trenches by Sergeant Will Streets. Hushed is the shriek of hurtling shells, and hark! Somewhere within that bit of soft blue sky, grand in his loneliness, his ecstasy, his lyric wild and free, carols a lark. I in the trench, he lost in heaven afar. I dream of love, its ecstasy he sings, doth lure my soul to love till like a star it flashes into life. O tireless wings that beat love's message into melody, a song that touches in this place remote gladness supreme in its undying note, and stirs to life the soul of memory. 'Tis strange that while you're beating into life, men here below are plunged in sanguine strife.
To me, half the war is a memory of trees, fallen and tortured trees, trees untouched in a summer moonlight, torn and shattered winter trees, trees green and brown, grey and white, living and dead. They gave names to roads and trenches, strong points and areas. Beneath their branches I found the best and worst of war, heard nightingales and smelt primroses, heard the scream of endless shells and breathed gas, rested in their shade, spied from their branches, cowered in their roots. They carried our telephone lines, hid our horses, guided us to and from battle, and formed the memorial to many efforts of our arms. Lieutenant Richard Talbot Kelly.
Lines from Festubert 1916 by 2nd Lieutenant Edmund Blunden, MC. Deep red the rose burned in the grim redoubt. The self-sown wheat around was like a flood. In the hot path the lizards lolled, time out. The saints in broken shrines were bright as blood. Shrewd bit the morning fog, the whining shot spun from the wrangling wire. Then in warm swoon the sun hushed all but the cool orchard plots. We crept in the tall grass and slept till noon.
There are many examples in which soldiers serving on the Western Front wrote of their sensitivity to the pristine, undamaged natural world, observed both in the trenches and during expeditions behind the lines during rest periods. Sunrises and sunsets provided some of the most treasured moments. Remember, a memory of sunsets was one of the few things referred to by Vaughan Williams when briefly explaining the wartime inspiration for his Pastoral Symphony.
Growing brighter and brighter from one moment to another, the scene unfolded all the colours of creation. Before our eyes, the flush of the eastern sky gave place to an iridescent glow, purple and crimson lit to red and orange. Then, amid the mists, arose a chant of birds. The world was stirring in its sleep. Soon the heavens glowed with reflected light, each fleeting phase surpassing the former in wondrous beauty, and against this background floated a blotch of clouds, diaphanous and burnished on their lower edges by the first rays of the rising sun. A soldier's sunrise comes to greet us. Lieutenant G. P. A. Fields.
Evening came as we marched, and the brown fields of Picardy, now almost ripe for harvest, were emblazoned by the setting sun with an unforgettable splendour. The evening was in harmony with the thought of many of us for whom this could not but be the last march. Those whose daily lot is to witness the processes of nature, the awakening and renewing of life in the miracle of dawn, the coming of rest and sleep in the glory of the setting sun, have a greater opportunity of seeing life and death in their true perspective, a fuller appreciation of the place of man in nature. Subaltern Charles Dowie.
In an oak wood, on a natural terrace overlooking a smiling valley, we can sit at our ease and watch shells burst on the white line of the trenches in the distance, and so relish our sylvan retreat all the more. This is the most picturesque bit of France we have struck, a real joy. This wood, with enormous violets and bluebells, and the variegated floor of undergrowth in an oak wood, reminding me of Sussex woods. We have cuckoo echoes by day and nightingale song by night, and between passing rain clouds, blue and white skyscapes through the new foliage of the oaks. Every prospect pleases, and only war is vile. Lieutenant Harold Rayner.
I was interested in butterflies and moths. Once I found on a stem of grass the most perfect specimen I had ever seen of Hylophila bicolorana, a gloriously vivid green moth with white underwings, having just emerged from its chrysalis and dried its wings. I derived comfort, a kind of companionship, from this cycle of life within range of the shellfire and the total destructiveness of war. Such moments were priceless recruitment of spirit in preparation for the next round of fighting. Lieutenant Henry Lawson.
The floor of the forest was ablaze with white, yellow and blue flowers. The luxuriance was so unexpected as to make me feel that, as in a fairy story, I had inadvertently broken into some secret and privileged place where I had no business to be. As I picked my way through the trees, I came to a concealed clearing, thick with wild daffodils, mostly in bud, but a few in flower. What a revelation! Captain C.P. Blacker.
Some of the most haunting soldier testimony is to be found in descriptions of rural scenery and country life in the act of being scarred by the horrific realities of battle, shelling, machine gunning, gas attacks, and the explosion of mines. My platoon was attacking the German trenches through the cover of a wood, which at the time was being heavily shelled with shrapnel. The leaves and branches were being torn from the trees like chaff before the wind. Talk about Dante's Inferno. The whistling of bullets and shrieking of shells, combined with the echo in the woods, made us all seek cover. I dropped behind a thick tree to find head cover. Hardly had I got in a prostrate position when a shell burst over the treetops. I must have been stunned, for on coming round I thought I was perched on a tree. Then I realised that half the tree had fallen over me. I was indeed lucky, as the effects of the same shell killed one and severely wounded several others. Lance Corporal W. H. Seddon.
Joe Benz and I set off with a coil of new barbed wire. We're joking as we walk waist-high through a crop of standing wheat. Swish, 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 fly a stream of bullets, and we drop down into the wheat as the savage chut, 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 chut of the gun cracks in our ears. We crawl together through the wheat, then we're racing for the sap, only 30 yards away, but swish, 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 chut, 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 chut. That gun is fair at us again. Bullets are skimming the wheat. We can see the heads of the wheat flickering under the impact as the bullets tear through the crop. Joe's head goes up, and I know at once he's been hit. I wriggle through the wheat to him. I lie alongside him, and over our heads the bullets are still chopping through the wheat. Australian infantryman E.P.F. Lynch.
Gas drifted through the village at 5 and again at 7:30 this morning. It crept along the ground in thin dilution at a fair pace, well below the height of a man standing. Horses and tethered cattle were startled and tugged at their head ropes. A little dog on a heavy chain, unable to scramble to his kennel, ran about frantically. Hens flew onto walls and outhouses, clucking loudly. Little chickens stood on tiptoe, craning to raise their beaks above the vapour. Mice came out of their holes. One climbed the gable of a barn, only to fall back when near the top. Seedling peas and other vegetables were bleached and wilted. Captain James Dunn.
At about 7 a.m, La Boisselle went up. The whole village actually lifted up out of the earth. First of all, there was a tremendous shake. The earth moved about a yard backwards and forwards. By that time we were all lying flat on the ground. But we got up to see the whole of this place lifting up. It went up as slowly as anything, and whole houses started splitting and falling apart in the air. Great elm trees were going up, their roots turning upside down. They must have gone up a tremendous height in the sky. When they reached the top, they disintegrated into bits and pieces and dust and clouds. Victor Packer, Royal Irish Fusiliers.
From Spring Offensive by 2nd Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, M.C. Halted against the shade of a last hill, they fed, and lying easy, were at ease, and finding comfortable chests and knees, carelessly slept. But many there stood still to face the stark, blank sky beyond the ridge, knowing their feet had come to the end of the world. Marvelling they stood, and watched the long grass swirled by the May breeze, murmurous with wasp and midge. For though the summer oozed into their veins like the injected drug for their bones' pains, sharp on their souls hung the imminent line of grass. Fearfully flashed the sky's mysterious glass. Hour after hour they ponder the warm field, and the far valley behind, where the buttercups had blessed with gold their slow boots coming up, where even the little brambles would not yield, but clutched and clung to them like sorrowing hands. They breathe like trees unstirred, till, like a cold gust, thrilled the little word at which each body and its soul begird and tightened them for battle. No alarms of bugles, no high flags, no clamorous haste, only a lift and flare of eyes that faced the sun like a friend with whom their love is done. O larger shone that smile against the sun, mightier than his whose bounty these have spurned. So soon they topped the hill, and raced together over an open stretch of herb and heather exposed, and instantly the whole sky burned with fury against them, and soft sudden cups opened in thousands for their blood, and the green slopes chasmed and steepened sheer to infinite space. The end result of all the bombardments, machine gunning, and military manoeuvres across rain-soaked fields was all too often an utterly transformed rural landscape. Paradise defiled.
From the Song of the Mud by Great War Nurse Mary Borden. This is the song of the mud that wriggles its way into battle. The impertinent, the intrusive, the ubiquitous, the unwelcome, the slimy, inveterate nuisance that fills the trenches, that mixes in with the food of the soldiers, that spoils the working of motors and crawls into their secret parts, that spreads itself over the guns, that sucks the guns down and holds them fast in its slimy, voluminous lips, that has no respect for destruction and muzzles the bursting shells, and slowly, softly, easily soaks up the fire, the noise, soaks up the energy and the courage, soaks up the power of armies, soaks up the battle, just soaks it up, and thus stops it. This is the song of the mud, the beautiful, glistening, golden mud that covers the hills like satin, the mysterious, gleaming, silvery mud that is spread like enamel over the valleys, mud, the disguise of the war zone, mud, the mantle of battles, mud, the smooth, fluid grave of our soldiers. This is the song of the mud.
The bulk of Kemmel Hill towered above us. 2 months ago I saw it covered with beautiful woods and peaceful rest camps. Now it is a bare, brown pile of earth, and only a few shattered tree stumps in the shell holes remain to mock the memory of its verdant beauty. The whole of Kemmel Hill and the valley and the ravines in front are one solid mass of shell holes. The earth has been turned and turned again by shell fire. The ground in many places is paved with shrapnel balls and jagged lumps of steel. In 10 square yards you could pick up several hundredweight. Second Lieutenant George Atkinson.
Everywhere around us, a wild confusion seemed to have upheaved the land, leaving behind it an ocean of rubble heaps. French helmets battered to shapeless lumps, and rifles red with rust lay in the stiffened mud, scattered among the countless refuse of the British and German armies. In many craters lay great pools of bright yellow water, whose stagnant surface disclosed many a rotting corpse. Coils of wire, like bramble thickets, ran in and out of the sun-baked hummocks, fluttering bleached tatters from their barbs. The mangled fragments of a machine gun protruded from a reeking mound, and beside it lay a human skull, picked clean by birds. Here, as we turned from side to side, odours assailed us at every breath, while a profound silence intensified the dreadful melancholy of the scene. Lieutenant G.P.A. Fields.
From the Hill by Mary Borden. From the top of the hill I looked down on the beautiful, the gorgeous, the superhuman and monstrous landscape of the superb, exulting war. There were no trees anywhere, nor any grasses or green thickets, nor any birds singing, nor any whisper or flutter of any little busy creatures. There was no shelter for field mice or rabbits, squirrels, or men. The earth was naked, and on its naked body crawled things of iron. It was evening. The long valley was bathed in blue shadow, and through the shadow, as if swimming, I saw the iron armies moving, and iron rivers poured through the wilderness that was peopled with a phantom iron host. I looked down, searching for a familiar thing, a leaf, a tuft of grass, a caterpillar. But the ground dropped away into darkness before my feet that were planted on a heap of stones.
And yet springtime and military evacuations brought the opportunity for nature to heal the scarred landscapes. And spring, of course, brought with it the resurgence of defiant birdsong. Many soldiers preserved the emotions they felt in words.
I cannot recollect any spring that thrilled me more. One felt that man might destroy himself and his civilization through the incredible stupidity of war, but the annual rebirth of nature would continue. Here was something assured and permanent, an established truth of constantly alternating values. Private Norman Ellison.
Out in a motor lorry, through miles of barbed wire entanglements, birds twittering and bees humming in the sweet scented air. The trenches are all overgrown with a mass of lovely wild flowers, poppies, cornflowers and shrubs. Nature going abroad with her pockets full of seeds. Nurse Alice Kitchen.
In 1916, mud. Nothing but water, shell holes, and mud. The most gloomy abomination of desolation the mind could imagine. And now, in the summer of 1917, no words could express the beauty of it. The dreary, dismal mud was baked white and pure, dazzling white. Red poppies and a blue flower, great masses of them stretched for miles and miles. The sky was dark blue, and the whole air up to a height of 40 feet, thick with white butterflies. War artist William Orpen.
We're back again in the old trenches which we used to hold. There's a great difference since then. The grass has grown so long everywhere that we can hardly see the German parapet, and the trees hide a great deal of the front too, now that they're in full leaf. These trenches still hold the original line through the middle of a wheat field, which was never harvested. Now the wheat has sown itself and is growing up everywhere in tall bunches on the parapet. Second Lieutenant Alexander Gillespie.
Oh, the catch at the heart! Among the devastated cottages, the tumbled trees, the desecrated cemeteries, clumps of crimson poppies thrusting out from the lips of craters, straggling in drifts between the hummocks, undaunted by the desolation, heedless of human fury, stupidity. Flanders poppies, basking in the sun. Fighter pilot Cecil Lewis.
Red Poppies in the Corn by Lieutenant Colonel W. Campbell Galbraith. I've seen them in the morning light when white mists drifted by. I've seen them in the dusk o' night glow against the starry sky. The slender waving blossoms red mid yellow fields forlorn, a glory on the scene they shed, red poppies in the corn. I've seen them too, those blossoms red, show 'gainst the trench line's screen, a crimson stream that waves and spread through all the brown and green. I've seen them dyed a deeper hue than ever nature gave, shell torn from slopes on which they grew to cover many a grave. Bright blossoms fair by nature set along the dusty ways, you cheered us in the battle's fret through long and weary days. You gave us hope if fate be kind, we'll see that longed-for morn, when home again we march and find red poppies in the corn.
Well, I hope that mix in some way may help your appreciation of the pastoral magic of Vaughan Williams's Symphony Number 3. Well, some of you may be wanting to rush off at this moment, but a number of people have posted questions via the chat facility. Just going from the top, Peter, do we know whether there was a personal incident or a particular friend that led him to volunteer? He wouldn't have been under any duress. It wouldn't have been without risk or danger. Was it simply his generosity that so often comes through in his music? I don't know of any such incident. Hugh Cobb, I don't know if you can think of anything, Hugh. You'd need to unmute if you did want to say anything.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. It has been suggested that an inspiration to enroll came from his hero, Walt Whitman, who did precisely the same thing in the American Civil War and went to look after soldiers who had been wounded.
Yes. Thank you for that, Hugh. Well, what he certainly did feel he had to do his duty. He wasn't anti-war. I mean, I think that was the case during the Boer War as well. I mean, he had straight away that sense of duty. And first of all, of course, he became within hours a constable in Chelsea, which presumably was a way of freeing other policemen to actually join up. So could the very interesting speaker say a word or two about how Macedonia fits into the picture? We know that Holst paid an interesting visit there. That was later on. You said Vaughan Williams seemed rather bored by this. Do you know anything about some? Well, there's lots of stuff. I don't think Vaughan Williams did meet Stanley Spencer. No, I deliberately kept the focus this evening on the Western Front because that's what we understand was the primary inspiration for Vaughan Williams. There is a decent amount of stuff. I refer anybody to Stephen Connick's recent book about Vaughan Williams's war. It's an absolute mine of information. It's called The Edge of Beyond. And does one still say it's in all good? Oh, there you are, Hugh. Does one still say in all good bookshops? I think we adapt that, don't we, for the online world. So Michael, that's where I'd send you for that. I'm sorry that wasn't a focus this evening.
Strictly, Andrew, it's not in all good bookshops, but it's available on Amazon, and it's from the Albion Music, not the Albion Records, the Albion Music website.
Yeah. The possibility of him actually driving an ambulance. Oh yes, I was asking this recently. I once asked Michael Kennedy whether Vaughan Williams ever drove a car, and knowing he was commonly chauffeured. I don't suppose so. I think he would have been quite awful. That was my assumption, but we had a discussion about this, John, didn't we, a few weeks ago? And you were sort of coming around to the idea that he possibly did drive, but I'm not sure what the evidence for that actually was.
Can I just hop in here, Andrew?
And I think you would have got that from Ursula.
Yeah, okay. So Jessica, yes.
Yes, because you asked earlier about what the role of the wagon orderly did, and I'm not sure I actually answered that question. He wouldn't have been the driver because that would have been most likely a member of the Army Service Corps. And ambulance drivers are responsible for the health of the vehicle, not the health of the passengers. It wasn't actually, as the Motor Ambulance Corps starts to take over from 1916 onwards, to provide most of the motor ambulance transport, it becomes less and less common to have a medically trained, any sort of first responder training, to have a medical orderly along with the motor ambulance. And the wounded men would just be stuck with someone who knew more about engines than they did about medicine. So I think it would be very unlikely that he learned to drive during the war, or that in fact he drove. And of course, bear in mind, these are the very early years of the technology of the motor vehicle, the private motor vehicle, and they're not easy to drive, certainly not as easy as the modern car is today. So you're muted, I think, Andrew.
There we go. And I was going to say that motor ambulances no doubt broke down on a very regular basis. Did Vaughan Williams ever ride a horse? Well, there is a picture of him in much later life, sitting very squat astride a horse, not looking terribly comfortable. Stephen Connick in his book actually says that Vaughan Williams didn't like going around on a horse behind the Western Front. He much preferred to use a bicycle, which of course he used a great deal before the Great War to get around London. Jessica, there's another one for you. Has anybody got something for David, please? 8 to 10 years ago, when I was last at Arras, there was talk of reopening an underground field hospital a kilometre or so up one of the tunnels that lie beneath Arras. Do you know if it ever opened as a museum? That's putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. I'm interested that you use the term field hospital, because officially that wasn't the term that was used. It was used in the Boer War and then reappears in the Second World War. But in the First World War, you have dressing stations and casualty clearing stations. And the idea is that frontline medical units are not supposed to be hospitals. They're not supposed to keep men in them for care. They're supposed to move them back as quickly as possible to the base hospitals. So the term field hospital isn't used officially. I haven't heard of that. I will have to go and look for that. But certainly it possibly hasn't opened, because I imagine in the 5 years I was working on my project, I probably would have come across it. There are some excellent medical resources, and the Wellcome Library has digitized the entirety of the RAMC Muniments collection, including all the papers related to the First World War. So that is available online now.
Yes, that haunting portrait. I wanted to say a name, and I'm not going to do it because I think I might have got it wrong. It appeared in the what was still a very new journal, Music and Letters, in 1920. And Martin and Shan, I'm more than happy to look it up for you and let you know. But it is an extraordinary picture. It seems deliberately to give that haunted look, which you automatically think, well, does that in some way relate to his wartime experiences? A satisfactory explanation of why he titled it The Pastoral. Well, we can only go back to those sentences in the letter to Ursula. I think we don't get any closer than that, unless anybody's got any additional thoughts on that front. It is interesting that when he rehearsed this whole business of what the language of music was, he referred in late life to Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, in a particular section in which Beethoven marked the music in a sort of way, not painting, but feeling. Not painting, but feeling. And funnily enough, that was pointed out in a book that Hubert Parry wrote in the 1880s. I wonder if there's some sort of connection there that remained in Vaughan Williams's mind, that he had Beethoven's Pastoral somewhere as some sort of influence. But really, I am busking this, and I couldn't go any further than that. Why is this presentation not a documentary on the BBC? Do you want a serious answer, Michael? It's probably, I don't know, and thank you so much, George, for saying maybe it will be. The mix showed so clearly the contrast of the destruction of war and the beauty of nature. The contrast is very clear to hear in the Pastoral Symphony. Isn't it intriguing that early audiences didn't notice it until Vaughan Williams pointed it out? It is interesting that one critic in the 1920s, Whitaker, I think, pointed out that trumpet solo was a cavalry trumpet, but he didn't go any further than that. It didn't make him think. But no, unless Hugh, I'm going to refer to you again. Have you any idea of anybody who sort of guessed earlier than Frank Howes, as I suggested? I just don't think it was just the assumption that England's pastoral composer would have written a piece of music about the English pastoral scene. Very, very strange. David, nobody's got a question for you. I'm sorry about that. but we are getting much closer to bedtime, I guess. But thank you so much to you all for coming. I hope that was of some use to you in your listening to this extraordinary symphony. We're deeply grateful to you, Jessica and David, for giving your time. So many things to take away from what you said. And of course, as I said to Jessica, it's been wonderful to have so much longer to really unpack that. I was making shortcuts all over the place. I hope in not too clumsy a way. But maybe the thing to do is, as I suggested earlier, to let all that stuff that has been presented to you just sink into your minds as we listen again to that 5 minutes of extracts from this pastoral symphony. Let it weave its magic as best it can. If you have to go, fine. But make sure that tomorrow you go on to Spotify and listen to the whole Pastoral Symphony and make up your own mind. That's absolutely 100% the way that Vaughan Williams would have approached this. He would have said, make of it what you will. What works for you is absolutely fine. I will only give you the barest pointer in the direction of what this music is about. And of course, with the Pastoral Symphony, very, very evasive indeed. So good night all. May the music accompany you as the day ends. Appropriate, I think that. Let me just find that music again, if I can.
just say thank you so much, Andrew. I'm going to have to go, but this has been a pleasure.
Well, I'm just sorry we couldn't talk for longer, Jessica, but it absolutely served its purpose. And thank you so much. And I look forward to being in touch again. It'd be lovely to.
I hope so.
I need to get your books and have a
yes.
thorough look at them.
I should say that the Royal Army Medical Corps book is available open access as an online download from Oxford University Press. So I can send you the details of that, which
that's great.
might be interesting.
Thanks for being with us, and look forward to the next time.
Yeah, absolutely.
There could be another one that you could help with in the summer.
Yes, well, please let me know if I can. Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, people aren't rushing to get away. You might want to start a discussion, of course, of what you were thinking as you listened to the music at the end there after hearing all that had been thrown at you. I mean, I've got very thick skin. If you think what I was suggesting was not up to the mark, by all means say so. I don't know how many people here actually count the Pastoral Symphony as one of their favourite Vaughan Williams works. You would, by all, and this is a moment where you can all unmute if you wish. And just let's have a free for all. If you want to hang about, well, we can do that. So
hello.
Yes, hello.
Yes, hello. Alexis Hood from Scotland. An elderly friend, now a deceased friend. Her father was 21, and after the ubiquitous 21 days, was injured. Seriously injured at Passchendaele, and he carried the silver bullet that lodged in him. The French surgeon in charge of his case declined to take it out, which was a good idea. But when he was evacuated by canal, by barge.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did Vaughan Williams, was he involved?
I'm not going to claim in any of this to be an expert, but I've not seen anything that suggests he did that. But yes, the canal route out was certainly one of the things that happened. I mean, there are some photographs of the interiors of the canal boats laid out for lots and lots of stretchers. And I suppose when you think about it, going by water is the most comfortable way if you've got terrible injuries. I mean, that must have been one of the awful things about being carted around in a motor ambulance or a horse-drawn wagon is that you were shook up the whole time. And if you had a nasty injury, that cannot have been very pleasant, at all.
Apparently he commented to his daughter later on in life that he thought he'd probably survived because he was taken out by barge.
Mm. Well, I have to ask, Alexis, what are you doing on a Vaughan Williams evening? Is it Burns night tonight?
No, yesterday was.
Or is it yesterday?
25th.
Oh, there you go. No, a friend of mine is, that's right, the Scotsman is celebrating Burns night tonight for some reason. He couldn't actually do it last night. That's what confused me. But I don't think anybody get any other thoughts that they want to share about that. But there we go. I think that's probably it. We should all toddle off, have a stiff drink, and raise a glass to Robbie Burns. I think probably, Alexis.
If I already have.
I'm deeply envious. It's just a possible. In June, July, there's another 100th anniversary, and that's of Vaughan Williams's short opera, The Shepherds of the Delectable Mountains. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back at all, but I've done a lot of work on this piece. Mm-hmm. And I think without any doubt at all, the way it was put together and the way the texts were chosen from Pilgrim's Progress, it is a work of memorial for the dead of the Great War. And if you want to revisit the Great War with me in the summer, well, we can do this. And it is remarkable work. And I could promise you, if I do put on an evening, you can hear the whole opera because it's only 23 minutes long. But
that sounds really good.
but it makes the point that you know, when being moved by a piece of music, you can be moved by its quality, but also by its qualities. The Shepherds of Delectable Mountains may not be, grade 1 Vaughan Williams, but where you know its provenance, it suddenly becomes so much more moving a piece.
Andrew, could I interrupt?
It doesn't change its quality. Have you eaten, John?
More or less continuously, but we've now lost 2/3 of our participants, so I think it's time to turn off the live stream. If you're happy. Do you want to say a few valedictory words, Andrew, and I'll switch off the live stream?
Oh, there's a challenge. I'm just so grateful to people who've come from far and near in the way that things happen these days on Zoom. Isn't it extraordinary that we're able to do this? Absolutely extraordinary. And we know to put up with the technical difficulties and the music not sounding as wonderful as it might be, and one or two things not being as polished as they should be, as they could be. But it works. It absolutely works. And we are a community. And I'm just so grateful to you for joining that community this evening. I look forward to seeing you again in the future. And just a thank you once again to all the people that contributed to this evening, not least those wonderful readers and Henry who put that mix together. I hope that